What if the person sworn to love, nurture, and protect you was the one who handed you over to unimaginable horror? In the quiet, unassuming town of Columbus, Georgia, a tragedy unfolded so profound, it left an entire community reeling. A mother, someone who should have been her child's first shield, stands accused of orchestrating the unthinkable. Kristy Siple, a woman once seen as a loving parent, now faces allegations that have shocked even the most seasoned investigators. This isn't just a story of crime, it's a story of betrayal, an act so heinous that it shattered the very foundation of trust. Authorities claim Kristy Siple accepted payment, not for a job or a service, but to allow a man to abuse her own 5-year-old daughter, Kamarie Siple. That child, innocent and full of life, would never see another birthday. How could a mother, a person entrusted with the care of her child, become the architect of her own child's torment? Arrest warrants allege she agreed to a price, a cold, calculated exchange that resulted in the ultimate betrayal. The details are not just shocking, they're incomprehensible. Kristy Siple's arrest and the allegations against her reveal a web of moral decay that stretches far beyond one home. But the real question remains, why? Why would a mother make such a choice? What led to this horrifying chain of events? And most importantly, could anything have been done to stop it? As we unravel this story, ask yourself, what would you do if faced with a betrayal so profound, so heartbreaking, that it defies understanding? This is the story of Kristy Siple and her daughter Kamarie Siple, a tale of trust shattered, innocence stolen, and a community forever changed. Kamarie Siple was just 5 years old, a child brimming with innocence and possibility. She was the kind of little girl who could light up a room with her laughter, a sound her family now describes as pure joy. She loved unicorns, brightly colored bows, and her favorite stuffed rabbit, which she carried everywhere, a companion in a world she trusted completely. She was known in her neighborhood for her curious spirit, often asking questions about the simplest things, like why the stars twinkle or why her favorite flowers, daisies, always seem to bloom brighter in her backyard. Her kindergarten teacher remembers her as a ray of sunshine, always quick to share her crayons or lend a comforting hug to a classmate who was feeling down. But behind her bright eyes and boundless energy, no one could have imagined the horrors she would face, or that her life would be cut so tragically short by the one person who was supposed to keep her safe. Kristy Siple, Kamarie's mother, was a name well known in the small, close-knit town of Columbus, Georgia. To outsiders, she seemed like an ordinary woman, a single mother trying to navigate life's challenges. With her soft smile and friendly demeanor, Kristy blended into her community, drawing little attention to herself. But appearances, as this story would reveal, can be devastatingly deceptive. Kristy had faced struggles in her personal life. She'd been in and out of difficult relationships and often leaned on others for support. Neighbors described her as polite but distant, someone who kept her private life tightly guarded. While she shared occasional glimpses of her daughter on social media, photos of Kamarie in a princess dress or holding balloons, there were whispers of instability in her home. What drove Kristy Siple to commit the unthinkable remains a question investigators and the community continue to grapple with. Was it desperation? Greed? Or something far darker? Her arrest and the charges against her would leave those who thought they knew her questioning everything. Columbus, Georgia, is a quiet town, nestled along the Chattahoochee River. With its tree-lined streets and historic charm, it's a place where neighbors know one another and children ride bikes down cul-de-sacs until the streetlights come on. It's the kind of town where crime happens but rarely anything of this magnitude. The death of Kamarie Siple, and the accusations against her own mother, sent shockwaves through the community. For those who called Columbus home, the news felt like a betrayal to the fabric of their community. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, and whispers of disbelief echoed in grocery store aisles and at church gatherings. How could such a monstrous act occur in their town? How could a mother be implicated in her own child's suffering? The local sheriff, visibly shaken during a press conference, admitted this was one of the most difficult cases he'd ever encountered. "As a father, this one hits you in the gut," he said, his voice trembling. "It's unimaginable." Columbus, Georgia would never be the same after that day. The once quiet town became the epicenter of a case that would grip the nation, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth. Even in the most unassuming places, unimaginable evil can lurk. And as investigators began to peel back the layers of this harrowing story, what they uncovered would challenge even the most seasoned among them. Each piece of evidence revealed a chilling reality, one that defied understanding. On the morning of December 13, 2021, a call came into the Russell County Sheriff's Office in Alabama. It was a report of a missing child, 5-year-old Kamarie Holland. The caller, her mother, Kristy Siple, sounded frantic, claiming her daughter had vanished from their home during the night. The community rallied immediately, offering prayers, volunteers, and hope for a swift reunion. Kristy's plea for help struck a chord with many. "She's my baby," she told officers. "Please just bring her back to me." But behind the scenes, law enforcement officers already noticed small inconsistencies in her story, details that didn't quite add up. As officers began their search, combing through Kamarie's neighborhood and surrounding areas, an ominous lead emerged. The search led them across the Alabama state line, to an abandoned home in Phoenix City, less than 10 miles from Kamarie's home. Acting on a tip, officers entered the property, where they discovered the lifeless body of a young child. It was Kamarie. Her small frame lay in a cold, desolate room, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. The sight shook even the most seasoned investigators. One officer later described the scene as something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Kamarie's death was confirmed, and her body was taken for an autopsy. Meanwhile, the house became a crime scene, swarming with detectives, forensic teams, and local officers determined to piece together the events that led to this devastating outcome. The news spread quickly. What had started as a hopeful search turned into a community-wide heartbreak. Candlelight vigils were held, and social media lit up with messages of support for Kamarie's family. But as the outpouring of grief grew, so did the questions. Who had done this, and why? For Kristy Siple, the news appeared to be unbearable. She sobbed openly in front of cameras, clinging to a photo of her daughter. "I just want justice for my baby," she told reporters, her voice trembling with emotion. To those watching, it seemed like the raw pain of a grieving mother. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to view her with a different lens. Within hours of Kamarie's body being discovered, authorities made their first arrest. A man named Jeremy Tremaine Williams, a 37-year-old with a criminal record, was taken into custody. Williams was no stranger to law enforcement. He had a history of allegations involving children, though none had led to convictions. And most chillingly, he had ties to the very house where Kamarie's body was found. Williams was charged with capital murder, and the community, desperate for answers, believed they had found their monster. But as investigators began to unravel the layers of this case, a shocking truth emerged, one that would redirect the focus entirely. But what the investigators would uncover next would turn this tragedy into a chilling nightmare. A trail of evidence would lead them back to the last person anyone expected, Kamarie's own mother, Kristy Siple. And the story of what really happened would horrify even the most hardened detectives. From the moment Kamarie Holland's lifeless body was discovered, the Russell County Sheriff's Office knew they were dealing with a case unlike any they had seen before. Sheriff Heath Taylor quickly assembled a task force of seasoned investigators to piece together the timeline of Kamarie's disappearance and death. Every minute counted, and every detail could hold the key to understanding how this tragedy had unfolded. Initially, the focus was on Jeremy Tremaine Williams, the man found with ties to the crime scene. Williams had a dark past, including prior allegations of child abuse and neglect. It seemed like an open-and-shut case, until investigators began to uncover layers of the story that didn't fit. As investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline, they noted several inconsistencies in Kristy Siple's account of the night Kamarie went missing. Her story lacked the raw panic they often encountered from parents in similar situations. Officers couldn't ignore the fact that something felt off. Neighbors in Kamarie's quiet Columbus neighborhood recalled seeing nothing unusual that night. "We didn't hear a thing," one resident said. "It's hard to believe something so terrible could happen just down the street." Another neighbor who had interacted with Kristy in the past described her as polite but distant. She didn't talk much about her life. She kept to herself. Family members also shared their grief, remembering Kamarie as a happy, carefree child. But when asked about Kristy, some hesitated. "She loved Kamarie, no doubt," a relative said, "but she had her struggles." Those struggles, it seemed, were beginning to catch up with her. Law enforcement officers, too, couldn't ignore their suspicions. Sheriff Taylor later recounted in an interview, "From the start, we had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The pieces just weren't lining up." The breakthrough came when investigators dug deeper into Kristy Siple's phone records and financial history. What they discovered shocked even the most seasoned officers: a series of disturbing messages and transactions between Kristy and Jeremy Tremaine Williams. These messages painted a picture of a dark arrangement, an agreement to exchange her daughter, Kamarie, for money. It was a moment that shifted the entire trajectory of the case. Kristy Siple, the grieving mother who had tearfully begged for justice, was now at the center of the investigation. Officers began to scrutinize every detail of her story, every movement she had made in the hours leading up to Kamarie's disappearance. The evidence was damning. Not only had Kristy exchanged messages with Williams, but records also indicated she had received a payment shortly before Kamarie went missing. To law enforcement, this was no coincidence. It was the missing link in a horrifying chain of events. By this point, Kristy Siple's behavior had also raised red flags. While she had appeared devastated in public, privately, her demeanor seemed strangely detached. Detectives later noted that her reactions lacked the urgency and desperation typical of a grieving parent. Sheriff Taylor remarked, "It was like she was playing a part, but the cracks in her story were starting to show." On December 28, 2021, just 2 weeks after Kamarie's death, Kristy Siple was taken into custody. She was charged with human trafficking, murder, and multiple counts of sexual abuse related to her daughter. The community, already grappling with the loss of Kamarie, now faced the unthinkable reality that her own mother had played a role in her death. For the investigators, this was a pivotal moment. The focus had shifted from a single suspect to a more complex, chilling narrative, one that revealed the depths of betrayal and depravity in this tragic case. But the arrest of Kristy Siple was just the beginning. As the investigation deepened, the full extent of her actions, and the shocking details of what Kamarie endured, would come to light. What could drive a mother to such unimaginable cruelty? The answers would leave even seasoned prosecutors stunned. As the details of the case continued to unfold, the small town of Phoenix City, Alabama, was left in shock. What had once been a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, was now grappling with the unthinkable. How could a mother betray her own child so horribly? How could a man with such a troubled history exploit an innocent little girl? The community had no answers, only pain and outrage. The emotional weight of the case hit hard, not just in Phoenix City but across the nation. At the courthouse, protests began within days of Kristy Siple's arrest, with community leaders and activists demanding justice for Kamarie. They called for tougher laws on child protection, and some even sought to change legislation that allowed people like Jeremy Williams to evade justice for so long. Local leaders were vocal about the horror they felt, with one community leader saying, "We may never be the same again. How do we heal after this? How do we look at each other knowing what happened? Our children are supposed to be safe. This is beyond what we can understand." The outrage didn't just come from the public. It came from within the families who knew Kamarie. Family members described their shock and disbelief that the woman who was supposed to protect her daughter was the very one who allowed her to suffer in the most unimaginable way. "I can't even begin to explain what we're feeling," one relative said, their voice choked with emotion. "We love that little girl so much. She didn't deserve this." As the investigation progressed and the public learned more about Kamarie's tragic end, the weight of the loss became increasingly evident. The 5-year-old girl, who had once been full of joy, had become a symbol of innocence lost and a warning about the horrors that could be hidden behind closed doors. Her family described her as a vibrant, energetic child with an infectious laugh. Kamarie loved to sing, her grandmother shared. She'd sing her favorite songs all day long no matter where we were. That was her, always happy, always singing. It didn't matter where she was, she made everyone smile. The community rallied together to remember Kamarie, holding vigils that drew hundreds of people. In one, her mother's absence was palpable. Kristy Siple, the woman responsible for the unspeakable crime, was locked away, but for those who had known and loved Kamarie, the pain was just beginning. For many, there would never be enough justice to make sense of the loss. Many in the crowd wore shirts bearing Kamarie's image, her infectious smile printed in bright colors. A reminder of the little girl who would never get to grow up, to sing, or to experience the simple joys of childhood again. For the community, Kamarie's loss was felt deeply, and the grief was shared in every corner of Phoenix City. Her death left a hole in the hearts of those who had known her best. "She was so small," one local teacher said. "She was just learning how to read, how to write, how to dream. Now, all we can do is remember her for the light she brought into our lives, even for such a short time." As public outrage continued to build, the demand for justice grew stronger. The community refused to accept that anyone, especially a mother, could act in such a horrific way. The tragic loss of Kamarie had not only affected her family but had shaken the very foundation of trust that had once existed in their small town. Every person in Phoenix City felt the collective heartbreak, and every parent questioned how they could ensure their children were protected from such horror. The emotional toll of the case prompted some to call for reform. They wanted laws to be stricter, they wanted more resources for child protective services, and they wanted to ensure that no other child would fall through the cracks as Kamarie had. A local lawmaker spoke out, saying, "This isn't just a criminal case, it's a wake-up call. We need to do more to protect our children before it's too late." While the legal proceedings continued, the emotional wounds in Phoenix City were slow to heal. The case, as disturbing and brutal as it was, had become more than just a story. It had become a symbol of the vulnerability of children and the betrayal of those meant to protect them. Kamarie's memory would never fade from the minds of those who knew her. Her name, her face, and the life she had lost would be a constant reminder to the community about the importance of vigilance and compassion in protecting the most vulnerable. The grief was not just a local sentiment, it reverberated across the nation. Parents everywhere held their children a little tighter, afraid of what could happen behind closed doors, never imagining the depths of betrayal that could exist. But for Kamarie it was too late. Her fate had been sealed in an agreement that no child should ever have to endure. As the community of Phoenix City continues to grieve, and as the trial unfolds, one thing remains clear. Kamarie's story will never be forgotten. Her life, her innocence, and her memory will serve as a constant reminder to fight for justice, to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. The trial of Kristy Siple and Jeremy Tremaine Williams will continue to unfold in the coming months, and the full extent of their actions will be brought to light. But no matter the verdict, the scar left by Kamarie's death will never fully heal. The question remains, will justice be enough to bring peace to the community that loved her? As the days passed following the tragic discovery of Kamarie's death, the media quickly picked up on the story. What initially appeared to be the tragic loss of an innocent child soon turned into one of the most disturbing criminal cases the state of Alabama had ever seen. The case gripped local, national, and even international headlines as more chilling details emerged. Kristy Siple's arrest, initially met with disbelief, soon became the focus of intense media scrutiny. National news outlets ran stories about the horrific nature of the crime, with every update seeming more incomprehensible than the last. The more investigators revealed, the more questions surfaced. How had Kamarie's death gone unnoticed for so long? Why had Kristy Siple allowed this to happen? And what role did Jeremy Tremaine Williams, the man accused of perpetrating this unspeakable act, play in the tragedy? The media painted a picture of Kristy as a cold, calculating figure, someone who not only failed to protect her child but actively facilitated her abuse. But as the case developed, more layers were peeled back, and the story became more complicated than many had initially realized. As the public tried to make sense of the tragedy, conflicting theories began to emerge. Some people believed that Kristy was a victim herself, manipulated and coerced into participating in this crime. Others argued that she was a willing accomplice, driven by financial need or a darker, more disturbing desire. But who could truly know what drove her to such extremes? Some speculated that Kristy might have been under the influence of Jeremy Williams, who had a criminal past and was known to exploit vulnerable individuals. His history with abuse, combined with the disturbing nature of his actions, raised questions about whether Kristy had been manipulated or controlled by him. In some circles, there was a growing narrative that she was merely a pawn in a much larger, more sinister operation, one that involved human trafficking and the exploitation of children. Others believed Kristy was simply a monster, someone who had planned and executed this horrifying act for her own gain, with no regard for the life of her daughter. The arrest warrant detailed how Kristy had reportedly agreed to allow a man to pay her for sex with her child, suggesting to many that there was a cold, calculated part of her that had facilitated her daughter's suffering. The court of public opinion was divided. Some saw her as a victim, while others saw her as the mastermind behind an unimaginable betrayal. As the media speculated and rumors flew, the truth became harder to discern. What was the real story behind Kristy's involvement in Kamarie's death? As the case gained national attention, it wasn't just traditional media that was speculating, it was the vast, unregulated world of social media. Online forums and social media platforms became breeding grounds for both outrage and speculation, as people posted their own theories, conjecture, and shock over the events that had transpired. The public was divided into camps. Some defended Kristy, saying she was the victim of a cruel manipulation, while others called for her swift execution. The voices on both sides became louder and louder, creating a chasm of emotion and confusion. On one hand, the heartbroken pleas of those mourning Kamarie's death echoed through the internet. On the other hand, the vitriol towards Kristy Siple grew as her alleged actions were brought to light, and the narrative spiraled into a frenzy. While the family tried to grieve in private, the internet had no such restraints. Every aspect of Kristy's life came under the microscope. Old photos, past interactions, and even her social media accounts were scrutinized, with some attempting to find clues as to her motives. Did the pieces of her past give any indication that she was capable of such monstrous acts? Or was this simply the darkest side of human nature that no one could have foreseen? Even as the case continued through the courts, the media's relentless coverage began to impact the investigation. Law enforcement and the judicial system were faced with the difficult task of ensuring a fair trial for Kristy Siple, all while the public narrative had already been shaped by intense media coverage. Could the media frenzy impact the proceedings? Could it cloud the objective truth? Lawyers for Kristy Siple and the prosecution alike warned of the dangers of public opinion being so strongly shaped before the trial even began. Every new piece of information, every new rumor, became fuel for the ongoing speculation and conjecture. Were the authorities truly going after the right person? Was Kristy a victim of her circumstances, or was she the villain in this tragic story? The answers were elusive, and for every theory presented, another counter-theory emerged. The truth, it seemed, would only be uncovered once the trial truly began. But as the story grew more complex with every twist, one thing was certain: the case was far from over. As the trial for Kristy Siple draws closer, questions loom large. Was Kamarie's death the result of a calculated betrayal, or was she the tragic victim of a broken system? What will the court decide when all the facts are finally presented? And perhaps most chillingly of all, will anyone ever truly understand what motivated this crime? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. The twists in this case are far from finished, and the ultimate truth may be more horrifying than we ever could have imagined. As the case of Kristy Siple and Jeremy Williams draws to a conclusion in the courtroom, there are still lingering questions that no one seems able to fully answer. While the evidence was damning and the verdicts were handed down, one question continues to haunt those who followed the case: why? What could drive a mother to betray her child in such a horrific, unspeakable way? Kristy's actions, her willingness to let her own daughter be abused and exploited in exchange for money, remain incomprehensible to most. Some speculate that financial desperation may have played a role. Kristy had been living in difficult circumstances. Reports suggested that she had struggled to make ends meet, living in poverty, and there may have been an element of coercion in her dealings with Jeremy Williams. But even this doesn't seem to fully explain the depth of her betrayal. There are also questions surrounding Kristy's relationship with Williams. Was she truly manipulated, or was there something more sinister driving her actions? Was there a pre-existing relationship between Kristy and Williams, one that went beyond the dark arrangement they entered into? Investigators couldn't fully answer these questions. While their investigation revealed much, there were still pieces of the puzzle that refused to fall into place. Some of the most unsettling mysteries revolve around what Kristy's true motivations were. Could it have been greed? Desperation? Or was it something deeper, something dark that perhaps only Kristy truly understood? Whatever it was, the unanswered questions continue to cast a long shadow over the case. While the primary suspects in this case were clearly Kristy Siple and Jeremy Williams, there were whispers of other possible figures lurking in the background. According to some reports, there were individuals in Kristy's life who might have had knowledge of her actions or who may have been aware of her circumstances but never came forward. Some speculated that Kristy's involvement with Jeremy Williams was not the only secret she was hiding. Was there anyone else who played a part in facilitating the horrific abuse, or was there someone who could have intervened? The police have not made any public claims about other suspects, but the suspicion remains. Could there have been someone in Kristy's life, maybe another man or even a friend, who knew what was going on and turned a blind eye? Or were there others complicit in the crime in some way, acting as enablers? Despite the exhaustive investigation, law enforcement was unable to link any other individuals to the crime beyond Kristy and Jeremy. But the possibility that other people may have been involved, or could have done more to prevent it, lingers. Even though they were convicted, the full extent of the circle that surrounded this horrific crime may never be fully known. As the trial concluded and the community came to terms with the outcomes, one thing became clear: this case had left an indelible mark on the small town in Alabama. What was once a quiet, close-knit community now found itself grappling with the horror of the crime that had unfolded in their midst. The very idea that such an atrocity could happen right under their noses, especially involving a mother and her child, shattered the sense of safety that many had taken for granted. The town of insert town name had always been a place where neighbors knew each other, where children played in their yards without fear. But after Kamarie's death, the community was left with a sense of vulnerability, wondering how something so monstrous could happen in their own backyard. Local organizations, community leaders, and child advocacy groups banded together to ensure that the case of Kamarie Siple would not fade from memory. They demanded stronger child protection laws, better resources for vulnerable families, and more comprehensive measures to address human trafficking and abuse. For the residents of the town, the crime was a wake-up call, a reminder that child exploitation and abuse can happen anywhere, even in the safest of communities. Among the most poignant responses were from Kamarie's extended family members, who had no idea the horror that had been unfolding in their own family. They spoke out, their voices trembling with grief as they shared their memories of the little girl who had once laughed and played like any other child. Their pain was raw, their sense of betrayal unmeasurable. They were left with a sense of helplessness, feeling as though they could have done more to protect Kamarie if only they had known the depths of her mother's involvement in this dark scheme. For many, Kamarie's death also sparked a renewed discussion about the power of secrecy and how abuse can sometimes remain hidden behind closed doors. The realization that people, neighbors, friends, even family members, might have seen something troubling but failed to intervene, added a layer of guilt to the community. Could they have stopped it? Could they have saved her? The case, while tragic, also became a turning point in the way that the community approached child protection. Advocates for children's rights and welfare began pushing for stricter laws surrounding child exploitation, including more severe penalties for those who facilitated abuse. But perhaps the most significant development was the increase in education and awareness about child trafficking and the signs of abuse, both physical and psychological. The town schools began holding workshops on recognizing signs of abuse, training teachers and counselors to identify children who might be at risk. Local police departments and social workers worked together to create a task force that would be better equipped to intervene in potential cases of abuse before it was too late. There was a greater emphasis on providing families in crisis with resources, and ensuring that children in at-risk households received the help they needed to thrive. The shock of Kamarie's death may have been a dark chapter for this community, but it also fueled a desire for change that would ensure that other children would not have to suffer the same fate. It wasn't the justice Kamarie deserved, but it was something. A commitment to safeguarding the next generation from the horrors that had unfolded in their midst. Kristy Siple's conviction and the resulting changes to the community's child protection laws serve as a harsh reminder of the fragility of childhood innocence. The case of Kamarie Siple will forever be a symbol of what happens when trust is violated in the most horrific way possible. And as the community continues to heal from this unimaginable loss, one thing remains clear. No matter how much time passes, the memory of Kamarie and the lessons learned from her case will continue to shape the fight for child protection for years to come. Thank you for watching. If you have any thoughts on this case or what we can do to protect children from such horrors, we encourage you to leave your thoughts below. Share this video to spread awareness and continue the conversation about child protection in our communities. If you've been moved by Kamarie's story, please consider supporting organizations working to prevent child abuse and exploitation. Together we can make a difference. This case, the murder of little Kamarie Siple, a child who should have been loved and protected at all costs, leaves us with more than just questions. It leaves us with a profound responsibility. A responsibility to be vigilant, to pay attention to the signs that might otherwise be ignored, and to stand up for the most vulnerable among us, the children who cannot protect themselves. Vigilance is more than just knowing the faces of the people around us. It's being aware of the subtle signs of distress, of changes in behavior, or even just a feeling that something isn't right. It's about being present in the lives of the children around us, whether they're our own, a neighbor's, or a child we encounter in a grocery store or on the street. It's about protecting them even if we're not their parents. In the case of Kamarie Siple, the horrific truth is that the very person who should have been her protector, the person she should have been able to trust, was the one who betrayed her most. Kristy Siple's actions were beyond incomprehensible. She chose to place her child in the hands of a man who would harm her. She made a choice that was not only devastating for Kamarie but also for the community, for the family who never saw this coming, and for all of us who are left asking, how could this happen? Yet the tragedy doesn't end with Kristy's actions. The entire community was left reeling, trying to understand how this betrayal could have gone unnoticed, how no one stepped in to stop this. It reminds us that our responsibility is not only to love and protect the children we know but also to be mindful of those who may be at risk of harm, even if it's not immediately obvious. We cannot change the past, but we have the power to shape the future. The case of Kamarie